You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Earlier this year, President Biden appointed a new head of the World Bank, former MasterCard CEO Ajay Banga. It may come as a surprise to some that the U.S. chooses the World Bank president. That means responsibility for guiding the bank, and its charge to improve the economies of developing nations rests on the shoulders of American voters. In a sharp departure from his predecessor, Trump appointee David Malpass, who at one point denied the role of fossil fuels in warming the planet, Banga unveiled a new vision for the financial institution, which includes climate change high on the list of the bank's priorities. Within the World Bank itself, there's been a lot of debate about whether climate change is complementary or something different from the bank's traditional agenda altogether. But the bank's realignment suggests the challenges of income inequality and climate need to be addressed together, not separately. Joining us now is Jorge Familiar, the Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank. Jorge Familiar, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have a lot of money under management, and you wear several hats at the World Bank. And you've been there a while. Tell us how the bank has changed since you first got there.
Well, the bank is constantly evolving. There have been some major breaking points or inflection points during my time there. The first one, when we went from a single focus on poverty to also cover inequality, when we, under President Kim, moved to the twin goals from poverty reduction and also boosting shared prosperity. And the second major moment of change is today, it's right now, when we are recognizing that dealing with global challenges, dealing with global public goods needs to be an intrinsic, central part of our mandate. I mean, just last week, during our annual meetings, our members embraced a new mission and vision for the bank. Eradicating poverty. Our dream is a world free of poverty in a livable planet. And now we are making explicit our role with respect to global public goods as well in our mission.
In the old days, international critics of the World Bank, the IMF, and other international development and aid agencies said, you guys don't understand how people really live in the developing world. So when you go to West Africa and build an enormous dam, that's not necessarily what people need to make their daily lives better. Yes, I understand it creates a watershed for creating protein with fisheries, and yes, rural electrification is important, but the world became littered with gigantic projects that often got these countries into serious debt problems. Was there a rethink? Was there a point where not only the World Bank, but other agencies working in that space said, we have to be closer to the ground, but also be thinking not only just of 20 years from now, but about 20 days from now?
Oh, there have been many rethinks on individual projects, right? Large or small. Each and every one of our projects is subject to environmental, social, and governance-related safeguards. We, for example, subject our loans to very strict procurement rules, financial management principles. So that is a shift throughout our 75 years of history. The other one is, and some of the comments you made me think of this, when we were helping countries come out of an economic crisis, right? There was an exclusive focus on macroeconomic management. Robust macroeconomic management is essential, but it's not the only thing that matters. Today, when we support countries coming out of financial and economic crisis, we also make sure that the poorest, that the less well-off are taken care of. No? So sometimes structural changes in the macroeconomic front, tightening a country's situation on the fiscal front, needs to come hand in hand with support to the poorest through social protection. And also, we clearly understand that poverty is reduced through growth. So creating the conditions for a country to grow again so that you can reduce poverty.
Let's talk about outcome-based bonds, because part of what anybody who invests in a bond wants is a high degree of predictability. And yet we're at a time of capital demand where the outcomes are less predictable. How do you design an instrument like this? And what do you tell the investor so they know what they're getting into?
So this is a very interesting question. So let me start by talking a little bit about our funding program, right? We have a large funding program, around $50 billion a year. Every single dollar that we raise in financial markets is used for sustainable development lending. That is our basic program. We are AAA rated, so our bonds are very, very safe. Investors can safely expect that they are going to get their principal back and they are going to get the interest back. Now, also, we are very attractive for investors that are looking for impact, that want not only a financial return, but also want to improve the world we live in, because that is what we fund. Now, we have taken things one step further. We have created these outcome bonds in which we invite investors that want to even generate more impact. We give them the opportunity to do so by, for example, using the coupon that would normally go to the investors to fund an additional development project. Let me give you a very concrete example. We issued a Rhino bond. In this bond, the coupon payment that would go to investors is going instead to 2 South African parks that are working on wildlife conservation, concretely black rhino conservation. If at the end of the life of the bond, which is also the end of the life of the project, we have more black rhinos than a given number, than a goal that is set from the start, a donor will come in, make investors whole, and even pay a premium depending on the level of success. If the project is not successful, the investors will not get their coupon payments, but they will get the principal of the bond because that is AAA rated.
And how do you market that? I mean, how do you find the buyers who are intrigued, who are willing to forego possible future income because they think it's, well, to use your example, really important to save the rhino?
Well, so that's also interesting. When we started offering this instrument, we found a lot of interest from investors. But for one reason or another, mostly because this is really innovative, they couldn't buy it. So issuing the first outcome bond took us 2 years until we found an investor willing to move forward and making the transaction possible. A few months later, we issued the second one. The second one is interesting because on that one, there is no donor. On that one, what we are doing is unleashing carbon credits generated by a project to generate this potential upside gain for the investor. And that one came together fairly quickly. So we believe that there is space to do more with outcome bonds, and we think that we will be able to scale this up.
When you read a prospectus, if a financial institution is offering a bond in the first place, it has to often conform to fairly rigorous internal standards. Is that where the problem comes, where an institution that helps its own depositors by guiding them to investments in things like bonds can say, hey, maybe you want to feel better at the end of this bond, but we can't necessarily say that this is the way to go?
So we offer something for everyone, right? And we are very clear in our disclosure documents on what is the risk that the investors are taking. So again, of the $50 billion of bonds we issue every year, the vast majority, by far, are bonds that are AAA rated. So AAA rated returns. So investors know that they will get their principal back and they will be paid their coupons. And also, they know that they will be generating a positive impact because of the nature of the operations of the World Bank. We issued the very first green bond in the world in 2008. Today, every single bond that we issue is labeled sustainable. So that is the vast majority of our funding program. Then we have the outcome bonds, which are these ones in which the coupon payments are at risk. And we make it very clear that that is the case and what are the conditions under which the investor is going to get a premium or has a risk with respect to the coupon. Another example would be catastrophe bonds. In those cases, investors are actually looking for a different type of risk. They are looking for exposure to catastrophe risk from a given country or from a given situation.
Well, let's talk more about that because there's no shortage of catastrophes right now. How do you create a bond? How do you design a bond that helps both on the other end, somewhere in the world where they are experiencing natural disasters driven by changing climate, and also works on the investor end?
This is a very interesting instrument. Again, it's a regular World Bank bond, so the principal supports World Bank loans to developing and emerging countries. But on top of the bond, we have an insurance policy. It's a parametric insurance policy to cover against a natural disaster. The country that takes this insurance pays the premium, and the investor in the bond has exposure to this, is running the natural disaster risk, and is compensated by the premium. The premium is determined by the interaction of supply and demand when the instrument is offered in the markets. And again, one of the interesting features that we provide is diversification to the market. The cat bond market is usually very focused on hurricane risk and hurricane risk in the US. We normally bring to market different types of risks, like, for example, earthquakes in Mexico or in Chile, or hurricanes, yes, but in the Philippines and not in Florida.
So if we have a calm year and not that many winds blow, how does that inform the way money's moving through this system?
The circumstances around the time of the offering clearly influence the price formation. Normally, the investors that participate in this market are sophisticated investors that are looking for a particular type of risk and a particular type of return, so they understand what they are doing. And, something very interesting is that through the magic of financial markets, you can find the optimal prices of insurance for countries. We just had the largest cat bond transaction ever issued for a single country in the world. It was for Chile. And it was a very large transaction that had two components. One of the components was a swap transaction with insurance companies. The other component was a cat bond. The driver for pricing was the cat bond component, which was something that I found extremely interesting.
Let's talk some more about climate change and its impact. Different countries have different challenges, whether it's rising ocean levels in the Pacific Island nations, drying soils and subsoils in East Africa, too much water in parts of South Asia, as we saw over the last year because of cyclical storms that come there. Does the World Bank have an approach? Did it make a policy decision about whether its responsibility is more in the way of making a world that's hardened to withstand some of this, or trying to stop the belching of more CO2 into the atmosphere as a program goal? You're an institution that's obviously in the crosshairs of some of these questions because your clients, their growth and their rise from poverty sort of depends on having a smart solution. But some people are saying, look, Superstorm Sandy, there's going to be another one. New York can't make itself higher, but it can make it so the next time a major tunnel doesn't get completely flooded with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. Should we be thinking more about resiliency or more about the mitigation of the changing climate itself?
The answer to that one is we work on both. We help countries mitigate their impact with respect to climate change, and we help countries adapt to climate change. This is embedded in each and every one of the operations that we put together. A few years ago, we committed first to that 20% of our lending would generate positive externalities with respect to climate change, would generate positive climate co-benefits. Since then, each and every one of the operations we put together is seen through a climate lens. And again, it's mitigation and it's also adaptation. And why mitigation and adaptation? Well, the core mission of the bank is poverty reduction. Our newly adopted vision is a world free of poverty in a livable planet. And then when we address, let's say, economic growth and poverty reduction, we are financing projects in all sorts of sectors. So, for example, if we're supporting a country in the energy sector, one of the things that we look at is to make these taking into account what the world needs going forward. So ensuring that there is a renewable energy component in our dialogue and the operations that we put together with countries. When we help countries put together infrastructure projects, which are fundamental for growth, we also make sure that these projects take into account what are the risks they will be exposed to from the perspective, for example, of natural disasters that will become more frequent or have already become more frequent and more intense due to climate change.
Right now, we are suffering the political consequences of a natural phenomenon. A farmhand in a Guatemalan coffee plantation doesn't want to leave his family and his town, the place where he's known all his life, and end up in Tijuana trying to cross the border into the United States. A Venezuelan whose country's future prosperity may involve pumping a lot more oil, which is not necessarily what the world needs, but it's what his home needs, is now living through a time of dysfunctional governance, and he ends up in Nuevo Laredo trying to get into Texas. There are Somali herders who are going to their traditional grazing lands and there's nothing for the cows to eat. They end up in refugee camps in northern Kenya. These are political consequences of natural phenomenon. And I'm not really sure whether the international institutions are really equipped to deal with this kind of thing. We've got a world on the move, a lot of places that are going to be really hard to live in, and no real country-based solutions where we can say, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it.
Well, creating opportunities for people is essential to root them where they are and where they want to be. So creating economic growth, creating opportunities, working in inequality as well. I talked about the way to deal with poverty is through economic growth. The way to deal with inequality of results, inequality of outcomes, is by creating equality of opportunities. So working in health, in education, in everything that makes people's lives better and more meaningful. That is part of addressing issues like migration. But so is working on things like climate change. More resilient society is a society that needs to migrate less. But let's be clear, there is no resilience in poverty, right? So we go back to economic growth, to poverty reduction, to reduction of inequality. Then, the World Bank also supports countries in analyzing what is the impact of migration into a country. And at times, the results of these studies is surprising and counterintuitive. When I had the privilege of being the vice president of the World Bank for Latin America and the Caribbean, we had huge migration from Venezuela to neighboring countries, particularly in Colombia. And we conducted a study of what would the impact of this significant migration from Venezuela to Colombia would be. And the conclusion was that if it was managed properly, it would be a major opportunity for growth and for a better situation in Colombia. So again, at times, the impacts of certain things that are seen as a negative is really not so when handled properly.
But as an international organization, are you empowered to say to a country that is actively disadvantaging one identifiable group inside society, an ethnic minority, a language group, and it's clear that they are really advancing policies that hurt these people, but they also would like some money. Can you say, sorry, we're not going to lend to a country that's doing this? Because equity is part of your structure.
You are touching on a subject that I am very passionate of, which is exclusion, right? I don't believe that we can be serious about eradicating poverty unless we deal with exclusion, and particularly exclusion of large groups of societies. Again, Going back to the region I know well because I had the pleasure of working in that region, the honor of working in that region, Latin America. Indigenous peoples, the exclusion of indigenous peoples was a topic that I was particularly worried about, but not only indigenous peoples, right? Also Afro-descendants. At times, the excluded group is 50% of society. It's women and girls. So, again, I think that inclusion is fundamental for development. Now, we are an institution that works very closely with our partner countries. Development has to be owned by the countries. So we can always find a space in which we identify projects that are good for development, that are essential for development, and that we would be willing to finance. And that is the way we engage with countries. And we have a frank and open and direct dialogue that at times leads for institutions like the World Bank not to fund certain projects because we do not necessarily agree that those are the critical projects for development. An institution like the World Bank lives in the intersection of three things: binding constraints for growth and development, areas for which there is country demand, that the country is committed to and wants to invest in, and the third one is areas where we have comparative advantage.
Because it wouldn't be that hard to design a scenario where a country in Asia, Africa, Latin America is actively pursuing policies because of state capture by one ethnic group or one linguistic group, where there's been historical exclusion of one group inside society, where the project they're looking for is actually a good project and would help the country. But they are still pursuing these policies that are hampering, limiting the futures of a sizable sector inside their population. These international chartered groups are very serious about sovereignty, and countries are very serious about their own sovereignty. Do you feel empowered to say no?
Certainly, when there are cases of exclusion of such nature that they do not allow for a normal relationship to move forward, the institution takes measures. But let me also give you the other side of the coin, right? Again, I'm going to the experience that maybe I know better from my time in Latin America, right? When I was there, we developed a very deep and profound dialogue with indigenous groups throughout the continent. At first, when I had my very first meetings with indigenous group leaders, there was a very high level of mistrust. I mean, they clearly didn't feel comfortable interacting with someone that worked with an international financial institution like the World Bank. Through dialogue, through a mutual understanding, through meeting frequently, we developed trust that led to a change in approach to the types of projects that we brought to the table and that we, together with the country authorities, we turned into realities. And again, I believe that is one of the changes of approach throughout the years that an institution like the World Bank has seen.
Jorge Familiar is the treasurer of the World Bank. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ray. A pleasure to be here.
That was Jorge Familiar, the vice president and treasurer of the World Bank. The conversation was recorded at the Global Philanthropy Forum, a project of World Affairs in San Francisco. This year's forum brought together an international cohort of thought leaders, community activists, and public intellectuals, all committed to tackling global challenges from right here in San Francisco. Over the next couple of months, we'll be sharing more stories from the forum as part of a new series featuring different approaches to shared problems like gender inequity, climate change, and an uncertain future shaped by artificial intelligence. So stay tuned. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Adam Ailey, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spade. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.